I said I'd make another one before the end of the year, didn't I? So, since our primary channel topic at the moment is the Russian Civil War and its spillover, I figured a thematic entry to the Carrier series would be Russia. Their experience with the floating airfields was very similar to the German one, a big clusterfuck that usually ended with them just building submarines anyway. But in Russia's case, they actually got a couple of them out, and even retain one at this exact moment in the history of everything ever, although it's kinda rough, but we'll get to that. They certainly tried. A lot more than you may initially expect. All big countries must have an aircraft carrier to be taken seriously, after all. So yeah, this is the Russian carrier experience. Interestingly enough, this story starts in ye olden days of the Russian Empire. The Tsarist regime was shockingly at the front of things when it came to the rapid development of aviation, with their first two proper pilot schools being opened in 1910. As such, the Russian Empire also put a reasonable amount of effort into the establishment of a naval aviation branch, starting as all navies did with converting a bunch of ships into seaplane carriers. They are my absolute favorite little wacky part of naval history, so hell yeah, we're going to talk about them. The Russians took surprisingly well to the new hardware, and observers noted that their seaplane carrier designs and crews were very effective. All of the Empire's seaplane carriers were created at various points between 1914 and 1916, all of them being converted from other ships. Imperator Nikolai I and Imperator Alexander I were two very similar cargo liners built in the UK for service in the Russian Merchant Marine, based in the Black Sea. Both displaced roughly 9,500 tons, could make 15 knots on a good day, and could carry between 7 and 9 seaplanes, which is a massive number for the time. As they were technically built as aviation cruisers, they also came strapped with Graf Zeppelin levels of secondary spam, boasting 6 120mm guns and 4 75mm ones. Their conversions were finished in early 1915, and they were immediately thrown into action against the Turks in the Black Sea. The primary use of their air arm was scouting, but there were many instances of the planes bringing bombs with them and operating as strike forces, which was a shockingly novel concept at the time. Their air wings have multiple recorded kills, and can even take credit for, possibly, the first use of naval aviation in an anti-submarine role in history. Furthermore, the crews and pilots had developed a great deal of skill by 1917, being able to cycle all 7 of their planes in a mere 14 minutes. Comparatively, it took the British about 20 minutes to cycle one. This is doubly impressive when you remember that none of these ships had catapults, and seaplanes had to be manually dropped into the water and then launched. They were used aggressively and effectively, and proved a very early indicator of the way naval combat was headed. After the February Revolution, these ships were renamed, and were largely left in port aside from a few operations here and there. They were captured by the Germans during Operation Faustschlag, and eventually surrendered to the Entente forces after the end of World War I. Both would be turned back into merchant ships and sold into French service, after which their story kinda falls off. Regardless, they were a very good proof of concept and an early step in the right direction for naval aviation. The Almaz, Russian for diamond, was the only carrier converted from a military vessel. She was initially built as an unprotected cruiser yacht and served in the Far East, holding the, distinction of being the only major ship to survive the smackdown of Tsushima in 1905. Watching all of your friends be massacred in front of you can't be good for one's mental health, I imagine. She was then transferred to the Baltic and then the Black Sea, being rebuilt as a seaplane carrier in late 1914. After her rebuild, she clocked in at 3,285 tons, could make a really solid 19 knots, and carried up to 4 seaplanes. Her rebuild also saw her standard armament increased, carrying 7 120mm guns and several AA cannons as well. She participated in several actions against Turkish ships, and served primarily alongside her adoptive sisters Nikolai and Alexander. In early 1918, her sailors revolted and declared for the Odessa Soviet Republic, a communist breakaway against the Ukrainian National Republic. She served mostly as a prison ship, and her hulls were hosts to the executions of many former Imperial Navy officers. Eventually, she was captured by the Germans, then the French, who turned it over to the White Army, which also promptly collapsed, seeing the ship return to France, where it existed in limbo doing nothing in Algiers for a decade before being scrapped in 1934. Arlitsa was the Empire's only carrier outside of the Black Sea. She was built in Britain as a cargo liner in 1903 before being converted into a carrier in 1915, commissioned to the Baltic Fleet. She displaced 3,800 tons, could make 12 knots, and could carry a maximum of 9 seaplanes, but usually carried 4. She also sported 8 75mm guns and 2 machine guns for point defense. Interestingly, Arlitsa rarely actually left port, since the Baltic Sea froze frequently, but she still saw decent action. She fought the German Navy several several times in the Gulf of Riga area and supported attacks on German positions in the Courland Peninsula. One particularly notable encounter occurred on July 16th of 1916, where she was attacked by a squadron of German aircraft, but through the power of this mythical thing called Combat Air Patrol and the exceptional skill of her crew, Arlitza's planes were able to shoot down 2 Germans with no losses. Russian seaplane carriers didn't fuck around. Her story kinda just ends after the October Revolution, however, and all anyone seems to know is that the Bolsheviks took her over, stripped her of most of her facilities and complement, and sold her back into civilian service in 1923. She was renamed Soviet and sent to the Far East as a passenger liner, where she would remain until being scrapped in 1964. This little grouping is a bit unique, and you may be able to tell why just by looking at the names. These were all Romanian merchant ships taken over by the Russians and converted into military vessels. Being a Romanian sailor and getting fucking press-ganged into operating cutting-edge military technology must have been an experience, to say the least. They were crewed by said Romanians, but attached to Russian formations with Russian officers. Romania, along with Dacia and Imperator Trajan, displaced 4,500 tons and could make 18 knots. The three had 4 152mm guns and 4 75mm. Romania carried between 4 and 7 seaplanes, but her sister's complements were likely lower. Regele Carol I was slightly different. She was much smaller, displacing only 2,300 tons, and was also capable of making 18 knots. She carried between 1 and 4 seaplanes, and had the same armament that the others had, but she had the added benefit of doubling as a mine-laying ship. Unfortunately, I could not find detailed accounts of these particular ships, and their service lives were relatively short regardless, all being returned to Romania and turned back into merchant ships in 1918. The exception is Regele Carol, which was turned into a full mine layer after her return to Romania. This lasted until World War II, where she was sunk in October of 1941 when she hit a Soviet mine. The Russian Civil War also saw the use of naval aviation in some capacity, primarily in scouting, but also for offensive fire support as well. The impact of these ships was unbelievably small, but they definitely existed. Comuna is the first, and she was kinda just a river barge fitted with an artillery gun and a couple of planes. For the time, this was actually super innovative, and if helicopters had existed, this would have been a stroke of fucking genius. It was converted from an oil barge in the Volga River by the Bolsheviks, utilizing what was left of Arlitza's complement to staff it, and was based off earlier British experience with similar vessels in Iraq. It needed to be towed by other ships in the river flotilla, and it definitely wouldn't have won any beauty awards, but the advantage a mobile airfield can provide on the battleground that was the Volga region cannot be understated. She carried, quote, a few seaplanes, but this article claims it was 6 and was armed with 37mm guns. She was very simple. She didn't have hangars, ammunition and fuel storage, or crew quarters, but it was a start. She partook in battles at Tsaritsyn and several other places along the Volga. Similar to most of these other seaplane carriers, her fate is unknown, but we can assume she was either scrapped or returned to civilian service after the war ended. That same article also includes little bits about a bunch of ships similar to Comuna, namely Poseidon, Svoboda, Smert, and Pripyat, all converted for similar purposes. The White Army also tried one, called Danielika, and 2 we'll get into in a minute. The majority of these were improvements over Comuna, actually having dedicated covered hangars and crew quarters and a slightly larger defense armament. Again, their fates are mostly unknown, and not a lot is known about them in general. What matters is that they existed, and they represent the attempts of the Civil War participants to gain an edge over their opponents. I did find a bit about Pripyat. The story of her being sunk 4 separate times is seemingly true. Actually, fuck it, she gets her own slide. Tatiana was a fairly small passenger steamer on the Pripyat River that was seized by the Bolsheviks in March of 1919 and rebuilt into a carrier, providing air reconnaissance and doubling as a floating command post. She didn't really do a whole lot of carrying though, since she spent a big chunk of her service life at the bottom of various rivers. During the Polish offensive in Ukraine, they captured her and put her into service very briefly before the Red Army counterattack, so Poland blew her up. The Reds raised her and decided to reuse her as a command ship before the Polish counterattack saw her blown up again. Poland elected to raise her again, renaming her to Admiral Sierpinek and pressing her into service as a training and staff ship. When the Soviets invaded in 1939, she was scuttled again before being raised by the Reds and renamed Pripyat. In 1941, during Operation Barbarossa, she was either bombed by the Luftwaffe or scuttled a 4th fucking time on the Dnipro River. 3 years later, she was raised a final time and put out of her misery at a scrapyard. Ending our seaplane carrier voyage are these 2. They were merchant ships on the Caspian Sea that the Brits took over and built to carry 2 seaplanes, which were later given to the White Army. Eventually, they were captured by the Reds and converted to merchant ships. I could find literally nothing else about them other than what was said in this article, so yeah. The Civil War largely ended Russia's naval aviation adventure. What had been the second largest seaplane force in the world at the close of World War I had been reduced to basically nothing by 1930, and the advances in skills obtained by the Russian Navy were largely forgotten as the Soviet Navy placed carriers on the back burner. Still, this did not stop naval designers from throwing ideas around, especially after the ascension of our good friend Big J Stalin. In his quest to be the biggest dictator of all, he sought big military stuff to showcase his supreme bigness, and ships were not excluded from this. This is the era of wargaming Stalinium Russian-biased paper ships, all brought to life with the finest pixie dust shitty Santa Crate gambling money could buy. Sorry, little off topic here. I probably wouldn't take sponsorships anyway because I am a boomer from ye olden days of YouTube and I like my videos contiguous, but even if I did, you would never ever see a World of Warships sponsor on this channel because I have actually played World of Warships, and I fucking hate that game. Anyways, amongst many a fantasy design to be built by a Soviet Union that somehow had double the naval budget, there were several aircraft carrier designs tossed around, and most of the ones you see in the wargaming list were plans to be real at some point. Now, of course, if there were a ton of plans, why no carrier? Well, there were three main problems with early Soviet carrier programs. One, they simply lacked the infrastructure to actually build the fucking things. Stalin-era naval buildup called for just an obscene number of hulls in the water, and despite the Union being a fuck-huge country, they didn't have very many naval facilities. Of those that did exist, even fewer were big enough to accommodate carriers, and even those that were would need to be retooled for carrier construction. It's not that they didn't want a big dick navy, it's that they were literally incapable of building it. Two, there was also a lack of political will to build them. As much as Stalin wanted carriers, he really liked battleships, and much of the Soviet Admiralty liked battleships too. Not only that, but when Stalin did the funny and started shooting people, the Navy got fucking hammered, being the branch of the armed forces most affected in the immediate term by the military purges. As such, naval innovation wasn't exactly in vogue for a while after this. It wouldn't be until the rise of Mikhail Kuznetsov, one of the Navy's strongest defenders and arguably its most competent admiral, that more emphasis was actually placed on carrier development, since he was strongly in favor of their use as well as naval expansion in general. Finally, the big reason for no Soviet carriers was, the Nazis. Yeah, carriers weren't a priority when the survival of the nation was at stake. So yeah, the vast majority of Soviet naval designs in this period were inherently unrealistic. There simply wasn't any ability to accommodate a navy of the size and caliber that Stalin wanted, and thus plans were changed and things were scrapped constantly. This is where it gets hard to actually discuss things in detail because they were all just that, designs. Most were based loosely around tried and tested methods from other countries, namely the United States and Japan, and for all intents and purposes, they very well could have been pretty effective, but they just couldn't build them. They also lacked effective aircraft designs to fill them with. The Soviet Union actually had a sizable naval aviation arm going into World War II, but they were all seaplanes or land-based aircraft, none designed for carriers. They also, obviously, didn't have names since they weren't built. The first dedicated Soviet carrier plans came from the damaged hulls of the Gangut-class battleship Poltava and the Borodino-class battlecruiser Izmail. These plans came about as early as 1924, but they never went anywhere since the Soviet economy post-war was, up shit creek without a paddle, as my folks used to say, and they were going to be stupid expensive. Both ships by this point were old and frail, so they were instead hot potatoed around various shipyards until they were scrapped later down the line. Komsomolets was a very theoretical planned conversion of a training ship called Okean in 1927. She was to be based loosely off the HMS Hermes and would have been a dedicated training carrier to prepare pilots for naval aviation operations and development. It was meant to displace between 12 and 13,000 tons, carry 42 aircraft, and make 15 knots, while also carrying a shitload of guns for training purposes. The project was kind of just abandoned after a point, mostly because of the changing political situation and the army stealing its budget, which is a very army thing to do. Project 71A was a design based on the hulls and machinery of the Chapayev-class light cruisers. They were planned to displace around 11,500 tons and were to carry 30-ish aircraft, and would have been the Soviet Union's first true flat-top capable of self-launching and recovering planes. 6 were planned and 2 were started, meaning the plans were sent to the shipyards and they began making preliminary constructions, but they had to be cancelled because of a little thing called World War II, and thus they were never realized. 71A is represented by Sirov, and of all the Soviet paper carriers is arguably the most real. Both of these projects were based on designs for the Kronstadt-class battlecruisers, themselves ships with tortured development histories. They were a symptom of the Soviet Navy really liking gunboats. Only 2 were laid down before Barbarossa, and only 1 survived the war in a state of 10% completion. After the war ended, a proposal was made to convert the hull into a carrier. Project 69AV was apparently to be based loosely off the design of Graf Zeppelin, but ultimately the project went nowhere when the hull was scrapped. Project 71B was less a conversion and more of a what can we do with these designs plan. It was going to be based off the Kronstadt and apply principles planned for 71A, but with significant modifications. But the project was cancelled because, again, the Nazis invaded. Both would displace roughly 30,000 tons and carry a number of planes, roughly between 40 and 60 due to their size. These are represented by Pobeda and Chkalov. This one is a pixie dust creation, purely hypothetical conversion of the Sovietsky Soyuz class that never actually happened. Weiji just needed a tier 10 carrier and ran out of documents, so they just started making shit up. This one was very much a design study, something that was thrown around as a potential idea for a future ship that never left the drawing board. Project 72 was planned to carry between 30 and 60 aircraft and displace 29,000-ish tons, with multiple varying designs and proposals being tossed around. It was an extension of 71B, but with more inspiration taken from Graf Zeppelin because that was kind of the only carrier the Soviet naval designers had actually been on by that point. Obviously, this was theoretical and was permanently stuck in development hell, being proposed and rejected in 1945. This final project was a light carrier designed for air defense. It was to displace 28,400 tons and carry 40 aircraft. It was planned out in the early 1950s by order of Kuznetsov, but after his fall from power, Soviet naval strategy shifted away from aircraft and more towards missiles, and she was also never realized. That is, to my knowledge, the extent of these particular paper carriers. I am positive that there are more random designs drawn on napkins somewhere, but at this point, this video has expanded so much from its original form that I'm ready to move on. Now, this is where things get a little iffy, because if you want to get technical, none of the ships I'm about to list were legally aircraft carriers. Moskva and Leningrad, along with all of the LHDs that they had and or designed, are dedicated helicopter carriers and are therefore banned under the rules I have set for myself. However, the rest are aircraft cruisers, i.e. the Russians didn't want to call them carriers. This was primarily done to skirt the Montreux Convention, the agreement that bans carriers over a certain tonnage from passing through the Bosphorus Straits. If you don't classify it as a carrier, then it's legally not a carrier, apparently. Despite their legal classification as cruisers, I am still counting them because they are capable of independently launching fixed-wing aircraft in reasonable quantities, and this launching remains the ship's primary function. The through line is that they carry guns and missiles like an actual cruiser, but have a flight deck duct taped to the side and can launch naval fighters and bombers as well as helicopters. They have more in common with the Japanese, helicopter destroyers that can also launch F-35s because fuck you, integrated air defense is base, than they do with, say, a Charles de Gaulle or a Gerald Ford, but I am still considering them carriers. Projects 1143, 1153, and 1160 were all late 60s, early 70s designs for carriers. 1143 will become the Kiev class, which we'll talk about next, but 1153 and 1160 were for full-blown carriers. If you want to get technical, 1160 came first and was redesigned as part of 1153. Don't ask why, it's fucking dumb, can't help it. Project 1160 was to be nuclear-powered, displace 80,000 tons, and carry 60 aircraft for long-range striking. Now, as it turns out, this shit is fuck-ass expensive, so in 1973 it was revised to Project 1153. It was functionally similar, but displaced only 72,000 tons and carried 50 aircraft. It was still brutally expensive, so it was revised and downsized a couple more times before being cancelled completely in 1978. Kiev was the name ship of the Kiev class of aircraft cruisers referred to as Project 1143, and she would be the first true aircraft carrier capable of independent fixed-wing air launches in the Soviet fleet. During the development of 1153, it was determined that the sheer cost of a full-blown supercarrier was simply untenable at this point in the lifespan of the Soviet Union, because fuck me, these shits are pricey. Thus, instead of building a full carrier, they basically jury-rigged a flight deck to a modified Project 1164, what became the Moskva, cruiser hull, and called it good, hence the name aviation cruiser. These ships were never designed for an air superiority and striking role. Instead, they were designed more like escort carriers in that their main purpose was to fight submarines. They were built with small flight decks and as a result could only launch a VSTOL capable craft. To accomplish this, the Russians actually needed to make a plane capable of VSTOL, leading to the Yak-38, the Union's first carrier-capable fixed-wing aircraft. The 38 was designed explicitly for the Kiev class and as such didn't see much use outside of them. The class also came strapped with every missile they could physically carry, but also came with a fatal design flaw called being built by the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s. As such, they were very maintenance intensive and suffered from common breakdowns, technical malfunctions, and other issues. Specifically, their boilers were very poor quality and their piping and electrical systems weren't much better. This will become a theme. They were also prone to catching fire, so yeah. The 4 ships in class varied somewhat in their individual characteristics, mostly in armament, so I'll talk about all of them individually. Kiev displaced 41,000 tons fully loaded, could make a respectable 32 knots, and carried a maximum of 32 aircraft, 12 of which were Yaks, with the rest being helicopters. She came strapped with all the missiles, CIWS, and hey, would you look at that, I haven't done this bit in a while, it's fucking torpedo tubes. If your carrier is close enough to something to need to use torpedoes, you have fucking lost. Anyway, she also had anti-submarine rocket launchers with, quote, nuclear-tipped rockets. I looked into it, and yeah, these little fuckers were rigged to carry nuclear depth charges. Nuclear fucking depth charges. Cold War science was utterly insane. Anyways, she was laid down on July 21st of 1970, launched on December 26th of 1972, and commissioned almost exactly 3 years later. As the first of its kind in the Soviet Union, her service life was almost exclusively dedicated to fucking around and seeing what could be done with such power. As such, she basically sailed around and did exercises for just shy of 2 decades. Her primary location of residence was the Northern Fleet, but she also spent a lot of time in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and the Baltic just so they could really get a feel for things. Eventually, the Soviet Union dies and the naval budget disappears, so she becomes a massive liability and kinda just rusted in port for a couple years before being bought out by, I shit you not, a Chinese theme park in Tianjin. She is still there to this day and even doubles as a luxury hotel. The naval nerd in me appreciates that she wasn't scrapped at least. Visiting her is absolutely a bucket list item. Minsk was technically identical to her sister, except she usually traded a few helicopters for more Yaks. So yeah, just copy-paste all the things I said in the last paragraph. She was laid down on December 28th of 1972, launched 3 years later, and commissioned on September 27th of 1978. Minsk was assigned to the Pacific Fleet, and as such, her career was spent on that half of the globe. She didn't really do all that much though. Again, no major war means mostly just training and sailing around. Minsk actually spent a lot of time in Vietnam of all places, partaking in some joint exercises and naval invasion training. She became much less active through the late 1980s as the Soviet economy disintegrated and was eventually retired. Her technical issues were particularly severe, and thus she was decommissioned in 1993 after a major accident. She was initially offered to Ukraine, since Mikhail was literally the only city in the entire former USSR designed to accommodate carriers, but since Ukraine was uber poor at this point, like most of the former USSR, they politely declined. 2 years later, she was sold for scrap, was promptly resold for scrap, then was bought by another Chinese investment company for, apparently, $4.3 million, which, holy fuck, is a kick-ass deal. That's less than some cars these days, and she's one of one. Too bad I was too busy being, not fucking born to buy her out. That would be a flex. Anyways, she was turned into, get this, another whole-ass theme park called Minsk World in Shenzhen. But the company went bankrupt in 2006, so she was resold, then resold again, to a company that sent her around to various places to be refitted, so they could turn her into a different theme park. However, she would eventually be just left sitting there for a while, slowly rusting away. In August of 2024, she ended up catching fire, which caused considerable damage, and as such, her future is uncertain, but I'd hazard a guess the scrapyard awaits. Novorossiysk was the 3rd ship of the Kiev class. Her spec sheet is the same as her sister's, but she carried a considerably slimmed-down armament in exchange for a larger suite of electronics and better helicopters. She was laid down on September 30th of 1975, launched 3 years later, and finally commissioned on September 14th of 1982. Her service life was short and uneventful. With Afghanistan voring money at an alarming rate, there wasn't much action to be had for little old Novorossiysk. She was assigned to the Pacific Fleet and, once again, mostly just did exercises. Specifically, the Russians pretended to blow her up a bunch of times in practice fighting back against carrier attacks in the Far East. As soon as she appeared, the Soviet Union fucking died and she was confined to port. She suffered a severe engine room fire in 1993, and 2 years later she was sold to South Korea where she was scrapped. The fourth and final ship of the Project 1143 line was Baku. She is considered a subclass though, because she was basically a straight-up improvement over her sisters. Her missiles and ASW rockets were improved and she had more of them, more advanced radar and electronic warfare measures, and most notably, she came with 100mm naval guns. She was definitely a lot more cruiser than the other three, but her air wing remained the same, so it still counts. She displaced 45,000 tons fully loaded, could make 32 knots, and carried 32 aircraft. Her improvements meant that she was a latecomer to the party. She was laid down in February of 1978 and wouldn't be commissioned until 1987. As a result, she did basically nothing before the Union exploded, whereafter she was renamed from Baku to Admiral Gorshkov. But you know what they say about renaming ships. Pisses off your choice of ocean-related deity. So, in 1994, her boiler room fucking exploded, which took a year to repair. She remained nominally in active Russian service, doing basically nothing until 2004, when she was sold to India. This is where things get interesting, because she was refitted to the point that she was basically a different ship. Those technical problems I mentioned meant that she was essentially rebuilt from the ground up without all the shitty Soviet-era stuff and an extra decade of naval engineering experience and technology. Her armament was completely stripped, her deck was expanded, and she was given a cope slope for good measure. She was also fitted with arresting wires, making her stow bar capable, and therefore transforming her into a real full-blown aircraft carrier. Most of her superstructure was rebuilt, her hangars were expanded, her boilers were replaced, her electronics were completely overhauled using advanced computers and radar, and much more. They literally ripped out 70% of the ship and rebuilt it. It is the carrier of Theseus. Her overhaul was done in the port of Severodvinsk, mostly by Russian builders, which finished in April of 2012, and she was commissioned into the Indian Navy the following year. As is the case with most carriers in peacetime, she almost exclusively has sailed around and engaged in military exercises since her conversion. She still serves to this day as the flagship of the Indian Navy, in what is a far more prestigious and well-kept condition than her sisters. And might I add, glow-up of the goddamn century. Let's be real, this is the one you clicked on the video for. In the late 1970s, the decision was made to build more carriers. This time, though, they wanted more carriers rather than cruisers with flight decks. So, the Kiev design was tweaked and expanded to produce Project 1143.5, now known as the Kuznetsov class. The Kuznetsovs were to be their first attempt at a proper full-deck carrier. She was still called an aircraft carrying cruiser to bypass the Bosphorus Strait shenanigans, but let's be real, she's a full carrier, shut the fuck up. As such, the key difference between her and her predecessors was the lack of the metric fuckload of missiles. The original design called for a ship of 65,000 tons with modern catobar systems and a sizable air wing, but the design was reduced to a more conservative 55,000 tons with the catobar systems replaced with a cope slope and a larger focus on VSTOL aircraft. Her hull was basically an enlarged version of the Kiev, but she was about 200 feet longer to accommodate a proper deck for stow bar. She did have missiles tucked away under her flight deck, but a lot fewer than Kiev, and they were reportedly removed at one point to make the hangar bigger. Much like her predecessors, she was very much designed for local strategic control, air defense, and anti-submarine actions. She also inherited a lot of systems and design choices from the Kievs, which would prove to partially be her downfall, as Kuznetsov has also suffered from a never-ending series of severe technical problems requiring extensive maintenance. Kuznetsov herself was laid down on April 1st of 1982, launched in December of 1985, and eventually commissioned on January 20th of 1991. She came to displace 58,900 tons fully loaded, could make 29 knots, and could carry 30 aircraft. She was originally to be named Tbilisi, which was changed to Leonid Brezhnev, then back to Tbilisi, before finally being renamed Kuznetsov. Now, if you look at that timeline, you may see a slight problem. Yeah. Her long and tortured history began with the Soviet Union fucking exploding in less than a year. She was still docked in Ukraine when they declared independence, and her commander was ordered to remain there while things cooled down. The ship was promptly hijacked and stolen by the commander of the Northern Fleet and sailed to a town near Murmansk so it could stay Russian. However, this was a bit short-sighted, because as it stood, there was not a port in Russia that could actually service the damn thing. The port she was at in the far north could barely keep her maintained, but she had to constantly operate on her own power and could only be worked on while put up in a floating dry dock. This dry dock worked overtime, trust me. And, remember what I said about changing ship names being bad luck? Like, you know, Slava being renamed to Moskva and then being sunk by a country with no navy using missiles named after the Roman god of the sea kind of bad luck? Well, Kuznetsov got quadrupled down on by hers, and as such, her life went to absolute shit after she got kidnapped. From day one, she was absolutely plagued by technical problems and mismanagement. Here's a quick rundown for you. Her first deployment to the Mediterranean came in 1995 and 1996, which went okay until her evaporators broke down and half the crew nearly died of dehydration. Upon her return, she was stuck in port for 5 entire years while she underwent repairs and a slight overhaul that was delayed due to lack of funding and good old-fashioned corruption. Her next mission was to participate in efforts to salvage the submarine Kursk after it sank in a massive display of incompetence on behalf of the Russian Navy. During an exercise in 2005, her arresting wires malfunctioned and she lost a very expensive Su-33 to the Atlantic Ocean and almost lost a second. She was dry docked again in 2006 for more repairs and overhauls. Her 2007 and 2008 deployments were relatively uneventful. This was punished by 2009 seeing her catch fire in Turkey and then cause an ecological disaster off the coast of Ireland. In 2011 and 2012, she made a round trip to Tarsus Naval Base for exercises. On the way back, her engine shit the bed off the coast of France and she needed to be towed by a tugboat the rest of the way. She had more uneventful exercises before 2016, where she would have the honor of being the first Russian carrier to actually engage in combat, but not before she lost another aircraft to a broken arrestor wire. She bombed terrorist groups in Syria in November, which was pretty successful, but at the cost of losing another plane to the arrestor wires fucking up again. This would prove to be the ship's last hurrah, so to speak, as she was dry docked in early 2017 for modernization to fix her shitty old Soviet systems. This is where shit really hits the fan. Her attempted overhaul has been plagued with problems, mostly stemming from basically her entire budget being embezzled. That floating dry dock I mentioned earlier sank with her in it in 2018, with a crane collapse destroying her flight deck. This meant that the Navy needed to basically build an entirely new dry dock to fit her, which took an extra year of her kind of just sitting around and rotting. After repairs began, she caught fire again, which set all of their efforts back completely. Things kept getting delayed and pushed back, and costs kept getting higher and higher. She also needs to be towed literally everywhere because her boilers give out constantly. When she does run, her funnel puffs with a very concerning black smoke due to the absolutely awful quality of her boilers and piping systems, which are basically incapable of properly processing the fuel that she uses. These shitty pipes also mean that she struggles to supply and filter water around the ship properly, and this is just the stuff that the Russian Navy has admitted to, which, coming from a country notorious for underreporting problems and hardware issues in regards to its military, says a lot about the state of Kuznetsov. Also, according to admittedly less than credible sources, the ship might be haunted. She has a machine spirit and it is fucking angry, and entire decks are sealed off for seemingly no reason. She's basically the fucking event horizon at this point. That, or her wisdom cube activated or something. In May of 2022, she was dry docked again, and her repairs progressed until the end of the year when she caught fire again. After this, the Russians seemingly threw in the towel, with reports emerging of her sailors being sent to go die in Ukraine. As such, her future is bleak. Overall, she was never really great. Being based off the already technically problematic Kiev class was a recipe for disaster, and 3 decades of wear and tear, constant repairs, corruption, a generally undertrained crew, and other bullshit did not help. As a Navy guy, it does break my heart to see her exist in a permanent limbo, yearning for a merciful death that seems to never come, all because the Russians don't want to admit that their navy isn't good. At this point, she is barely seaworthy, and I would guess that she will see a scrapyard at some point in the next couple of years. I will say, though, she has done a lot to help the Ukrainian war effort by being an absolute black hole of money and maintenance, so I suppose that counts for something. Varyag is somewhat difficult to quantify. She was Kuznetsov's sister, and initially was to have basically the same specs. She was laid down in December of 1985 and was launched 3 years later, but work on her was stopped at 68% when the Soviet Union died. This is where things get kind of funky, because if you want to get super technical, she was never formally commissioned into the Soviet, Russian, or even Ukrainian navies before she was sold to China. Then, the Chinese finished her with a considerably altered design, making her not really a Russian carrier at all. Furthermore, I think she's far more interesting to talk about in the context of Chinese carrier development, so I'm gonna make an executive decision and take a rain check on talking about her for now. Just know that she exists and was technically built by the Soviet Union, but also not really. Alright, so we had what if Kiev was bigger, and now we have what if Kiev was bigger. Bigger ship equals more gooder, right? The rather annoyingly designated Project 1143.7, aka the Ulyanovsk. It was based on the original designs for Project 1153, but would accommodate a larger air arm, more advanced internal systems, and catabar capabilities. It also saw most of the missiles and other bullshit cut out in favor of a larger hangar and flight deck. And of course, she came strapped with a nuclear reactor. She would have displaced roughly 80,000 tons, made a respectable 30 knots, and carried 68 aircraft. The intent was to finally finally achieve a true supercarrier capable of global operations, and this time they actually got pretty far along. To accommodate this massive project, the government dumped a shitload of money into the Mikhail shipyard to make room for this colossus, and she would end up actually being laid down on November 25th of 1988, getting to a state of about 40% completion. However, when the Soviet Union exploded, the new Ukrainian government was suddenly forced to deal with the massive hull sitting in their city. The Russians didn't have any money, and the Ukrainians sure as shit didn't either, so she was eventually scrapped through the year of 1992. I hesitate to include these on here because these ships are never going to exist. If I recall correctly, Russia has suspended development of carriers through to 2035, and the future of Russian naval aviation is once again not looking great. Now, I included all the Stalin-era carriers, so I'm gonna put these in here too, just to make things nice and complete. However, where the Stalin-era carriers never left the design stage because of more pressing concerns and changes in naval technology, these will never leave the design stage because they are fucking stupid. These two projects are a continuation of the elusive nuclear carrier that they keep trying to design. Clearly, fourth time's the charm, right? They are really big, really dumb, and expensive to the point that trying to develop them, build them, crew them, and build planes for them would be economically catastrophic, especially given the current state of the Russian economy. Furthermore, Russia still lacks the proper naval aviation experience to make these ships work, as the jump from Kuznetsov to these is absolutely insane. The Russian Navy is also not the American Navy, and quite literally would not have the proper escorts or massive logistical support system to keep these things alive and supplied in the event that they actually need to be used. Overall, they're mostly just ideas tossed around to try and secure any scrap of funding their con artist designers possibly can. Their models do look kinda cool, at least. Make a pretty kick-ass coffee table. Overall, Russia and the Soviet Union definitely had the carrier program of all time. They had a real strong start with their seaplane carriers under the Tsardom, and had the Civil War been avoided, it's likely that the Russian Navy could have developed pretty solid naval aviation. But of course you have the Civil War, then the post-war economic shit show, then Stalin, then the Nazis, then the general state of the Soviet economy, and eventually when you do get actual carriers, they are a far cry from the kind of ships you think of. Ultimately, for Russia, the problem was fourfold. One, the unique geopolitical position of the country meant naval doctrine developed to simply not need the long-range striking power of a full-fledged carrier. The Russian Navy is very far from a near-peer rival of any other major navies, and primarily exists to maintain local strategic control rather than project global influence. As a result, despite attempts at developing true blue water capabilities in naval aviation, there was simply always more pressing concerns like land, air, and nuclear forces, meaning that Soviet and Russian carrier programs almost always fell flat or amounted to little of substance. 2. The Russian shipbuilding industry was always woefully inadequate for maintaining a large fleet. The ambitious fleet-building programs of the Soviet and Federation eras were literally never completed and always infeasible without considerable further investment to the detriment of other branches of the armed forces. Building and maintaining any sizable carrier force was simply never in the cards, even with the shipyards of Ukraine. Without them, Russia has basically no way to build or maintain carriers or any large ships for that matter. 3. Carriers are fuck-ass expensive, and the Soviet and Russian economies simply couldn't afford the strain of the Navy devouring the entire budget for more of said doctrinally kinda useless carriers. And 4, the most important flaw with Russian carriers, their designs were kinda shit. They were simultaneously over-engineered while also cheaping out on important things like propulsion and actual aircraft facilities. This led to service lives defined by mechanical failures. Like, come on, literally every single one of their operational carriers caught fire at some point. This issue was further compounded by the extreme corruption present in the Russian military, causing desperately needed repair and modernization work to be delayed or have its budget siphoned. As such, the Russian carrier experience is defined by, I suppose disappointment is the word. Yeah, disappointment. As much as successive governments since the days of the Tsardom have wanted to LARP as a naval powerhouse, that simply never manifested, and more likely than not will never manifest. Regardless, I still think that they are interesting to look at, and still serve as a cool little piece of naval history. That about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.